of silence in honor of all the victims who lost their lives in the last 44 years since the beginning of the Islamic Republic regime in Iran. Thank you. Please be seated. My name is Pegah Solari, and I am here as a volunteer for the Association of Families of Victims of Flight PS752. As your host and today's panel moderator, I welcome and thank you all, families of victims, dignitaries, guests, friends, volunteers, and members of media for being here today. The path in pursuit of justice has had many ups and downs, but the public's continued support and contributions have brought solace to the grieving families. Thank you for remaining on their side in this long and unpredictable journey. I'd like to start today's meeting by acknowledging that the land on which we are gathered is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Confederacy, including Huron, Erie, Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Mississaugas of the Credit, whose long-standing history have helped shape the world that we live in today. Truth and justice, keeping the memory of all victims of Flight PS752, have been the primary mission of the association. Tomorrow, July 6th, marks the birthday of Sajideh Sarayan, who was killed aboard PS752. Sajideh would have turned 30 tomorrow. PS752 victims represent one link in the lengthy chain of crimes committed by the tyrannical regime in Iran. One recent example is the brave artist Toomaj Salehi, who has been kept in solitary confinement, exposed to violent interrogations for over 200 days. The association stands with the thousands of courageous Iranians who are leading the charge towards freedom and democracy. I'd like to mention that today we are also joined by family members of some of the other victims of the last 44 years of crime by the Iranian Republic. Today, after 42 months since the downing of Flight PS752, a major milestone is finally reached. With Canada's leadership, the 4 affected countries have referred the case to the International Court of Justice, and the Islamic regime in Iran must submit to the rule of law. As of this morning, it is confirmed that the 4 countries have jointly instituted proceedings against the Islamic Republic before the ICJ concerning their dispute under the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts against Safety of Civilian Aviation. The Association of the Victims of Families worked relentlessly for this major milestone. This marks the beginning of an important chapter for the victims of Flight PS752 and their families. In our panel today, we will discuss the significance and legal nuances of this proceeding and address questions relating to this important new phase of the association's cause. Before I invite our first speaker to the stage, I invite you to watch a video about the association's journey in pursuit of justice. Three years later, justice prevails. the third anniversary of the downing of Flight PS752. The downing of Flight PS752 represents yet another link in the chain of crimes that have victimized the Iranian people. 176 innocent lives were lost on the cold morning of January 8, 2020. In an unprecedented example of state crimes and aviation history, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards shot down Ukrainian Flight PS752 only 3 minutes after takeoff from the Tehran International Airport. Thus began a painful journey for the victims' surviving family members who deserve justice through a transparent, impartial trial. What happened? Why did it happen? Who are the real perpetrators of such a crime? What is our collective responsibility to help put an end to such inhumanity? 3 years later, the families of the victims of Flight PS752 have no answers to these questions. The doomed destiny of Flight PS752 posed a serious challenge to the free world that must finally live up to its values. So far, the responsibility has fallen on the shoulders of hundreds of mourning family members who lost their loved ones to keep justice and human rights at the forefront of the fight against tyranny. Within hours of the downing of Flight PS752, the Iranian government set in motion a machinery of deceit, lies, and distortions. Their domestic propaganda machine and foreign apologists and operatives were mobilized to whitewash the crime. After 3 days of denial and only under international pressure, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards of Iran finally admitted to the downing of the passenger airplane, but they refused to comply with international law and regulations and insisted on human error as the cause of the downing without any transparency or cooperation to produce evidence. The families were helpless in compelling the Canadian, Ukrainian, British, Swedish, and German governments who lost citizens and residents on the flight to hold the Islamic Republic accountable towards its obligations. Within 5 hours of the downing, the crash site was destroyed by bulldozers, but the international community remained silent. Not even a simple condemnation was tabled at the ICAO. The world faced an absurd situation where the very perpetrators of a crime were given the responsibility to investigate their own crime and produce a report on how their own military apparatus shot and downed a civilian airliner. Within months of the downing, the families took it upon themselves to form an association, and with the help of hundreds of volunteers and tens of thousands of supporters and donors from around the world, they embarked on the long and arduous road to justice, a road without a roadmap. When the Iranian government published its final report that was no more than an attempt to whitewash their crime and shield the implicated high-ranking military and political officials, Dr. Agnes Callamard, the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions, put the spotlight on the tragedy.
The reckless nature of the mistakes have led many, including myself, to question whether the downing of Flight PS752 was intentional.
Mr. Ralph Goodell, Canada's special advisor to the Prime Minister, published his responding report that highlighted numerous unanswered questions and emphasized the shortcomings and inadequacies of Iran's final report. Mr. Goodell remarked that Iran's final report was shambolic. By June 2021, the International Coordination and Response Group of 5 affected countries issued their notice of claim to the Iranian government. The association held a protest rally at the ICAO headquarters in Montreal to voice their frustrations and emphasize ICAO's role in their plight. The ICAO officials made no effort to meet the rally participants. ICAO's misguided reliance on neutrality only aggravates a situation where crimes are committed with blatant disregard for due process and transparency in good faith. Since the downing of Flight PS752, many agencies within the Canadian government acted swiftly and compassionately. The Prime Minister appointed a task force within hours of the downing, and government officials were dispatched to help the families. Financial assistance, special consular services, and other humanitarian measures helped the families cope with the shock of loss and grief. In August 2021, the association organized a truth rally in Toronto in anticipation of the upcoming federal elections in Canada. Thousands of supporters gathered around Toronto City Hall in solidarity with the victims' families. Soon after the federal elections, the 5 affected countries sent a reminder notice to the Iranian government on their notice of claim from months earlier. This too failed to get any reaction from the Iranian government that was overtly evading justice. The victims' families persevered in their relentless insistence on truth and justice. They organized an information booth at the Frankfurt Book Fair to engage the international community. They continued to meet with government officials and insisted on action. November 20th, 2021 marked a significant landmark in the history of the association. The open wound in the sky was nowhere near healing. The Iranian government unilaterally proceeded with domestic legal proceedings by orchestrating show trials of unknown, low-ranking personnel to further their agenda. The families and their legal representatives were denied access to the court files or any participation in the process. The association held a press conference on November 24, 2021, to unveil their 24-page fact-finding report. The report was the result of selfless collaboration between the association's fact-finding committee and military, aviation, legal, investigative, and forensic experts who donated their time and expertise to the association. The association continued its insistence on the need for a proper investigation by an independent international body to address these shortcomings and reveal the truth. The association steadfastly continued its fight for justice. Numerous meetings were finally held with ICAO council members. The association's fact-finding report was sent to all ICAO members, but the organization refused to deliver them and returned hundreds of packages with no justifiable reason. In February 2022, a team from the Ukrainian prosecutor's office traveled to Canada to complete their investigations. Unfortunately, the trip was cut short due to the outbreak of an unprovoked war imposed by Russia. We reiterated our demands in the countless meetings with government officials. The RCMP rejected our repeated calls to open a domestic criminal investigation into the case. The association called on the Canadian government to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization and to impose targeted sanctions on Iran officials who commit atrocities. In the spring of 2022, bizarre news surfaced in the Canadian and Iranian media. It was announced that the Islamic Republic of Iran's national soccer team was to travel to Vancouver to play a friendly game with the Canadian national team. The association raised its objections to this plan from day one, believing that this game was a sports washing scheme and an attempt to deceptively portray a normal image of the Iranian regime. After publishing an opt in the Globe and Mail, launching a public campaign to send letters to government officials, and finally planning demonstrations in front of the stadium, Canada Soccer changed its decision and cancelled the match.
We are happy that they corrected the bad decision that they made.
On September 14, 2022, the association filed its submission to the International Criminal Court on the basis of allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity after months of investigations and consultations with expert lawyers. The submission provided more than 90 pages of evidence and analysis against those who had a role in the downing of Flight PS752. To date, none of those affected countries have submitted a letter of support for this submission, and the court has yet to review and respond to the submission. In mid-September, after the brutal killing of Mahsa Amini by the infamous morality police in Tehran, a revolution erupted in Iran under the banner of women, life, freedom.
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن برای
The families of PS752 victims played an active role in mobilizing the community and echoing the voice of the protesters in Iran. By the 1st of October 2022, tens of thousands of people gathered in cities across Canada and the world to stand in solidarity with their courageous compatriots inside Iran in rejection of the Islamic Republic regime. By October 22nd, over 100,000 demonstrators assembled in Berlin. On October 29th, human chains were formed in cities around the world to commemorate the victims of oppression in Iran over the past 44 years. On November 19th, the association held a vigil on the 3rd anniversary of the bloody November 2019 silent massacres that took the lives of over 1,500 peaceful protesters in Iran. The Iranian diaspora around the world united and compelled the global community to stand with the women and youth in Iran who are on the front lines of resistance despite the brutality facing them. Meanwhile, the regime continues to torment the families of Flight PS752 victims by holding more show trials in secrecy. The families vehemently reject the legitimacy of such proceedings, but their protests continue to be ignored by the regime. Finally, on December 28 of 2022, there was a breakthrough. The 4 affected countries, led by Canada, issued a diplomatic note to the Islamic Republic state, putting them on notice to commence proceedings according to the Montreal Convention, holding them criminally responsible for the intentional downing of Flight PS752. The case will be referred to the International Court of Justice in 6 months if arbitration proceedings fail. This is the roadmap that the association has been seeking. The only way forward is to reveal the truth, disclose all evidence, and hold the real perpetrators of this heinous crime accountable in a fair and impartial trial. As we embarked on the 3rd anniversary of the downing of Flight PS752, we faced the same questions. Who ordered missiles to be shot at Flight PS752? Why and by whom was the Iranian airspace kept open during a historic direct military confrontation with the United States? What happened during those early morning hours of January 8? Why has the Iranian government failed to live up to its international obligations? Who was responsible in dispatching lethal air defense units, and with what motivation? Why is the international community credulous, if not silent, in the face of such inhumane acts of violence? When and how can this cycle of violence be stopped? The association continues to ask, how much longer will this painful wound over the skies of Tehran remain open? The association's steadfast pursuit of justice inspired communities around the world and, most importantly, sharpened the governmental officials' resolve to take action. The association made it clear to the world that the Islamic regime cannot commit crimes with impunity. Their mission remained clear. Justice and truth are the keys to accountability, not financial compensation. The regime in Iran made every effort to subvert justice by misinformation, disseminating lies, and distorting facts. Show trials were held at an obscure military tribunal where 10 unknown, low-ranking individuals were charged. Victims' families in Iran were denied representation and access to the proceedings. While suffering harassment, threats, and intimidation, the families in Iran issued an official statement that rejected the legitimacy of the military court and declared their withdrawal as claimants on that basis. A low-ranking official that was claimed to be the missile system operator was convicted of negligence and refusal to obey orders, and the case was closed under suspicious circumstances. The association maintained that the perpetrators of a crime cannot prosecute their own crime and insisted that only a qualified and impartial international tribunal can investigate and prosecute a crime of this magnitude. Today, after 42 months, a major milestone is finally reached. With Canada's leadership, the 4 affected countries have referred the case to the International Court of Justice, and the Islamic regime in Iran must submit to the rule of law. This marks the beginning of an important chapter for the victims of Flight PS752 and their families. The Woman Life Freedom Revolution that erupted in Iran last September represents a nation's collective resolve for human right and justice. The downing of Flight PS752 by the IRGC is yet another link in the chain of crimes over the past 44 years. Our mission to reveal the truth and justice for 177 victims of Flight PS752 resonates with an entire nation's mission for freedom and democracy, one that cannot be achieved without accountability. I now invite the spokesperson for the association, Kourosh Doustshanas, to the stage. Kourosh is also chair of the Government Relations Committee for the association.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, families, supporters, and dignitaries. My name is Kourosh Doustshanas. As a speaker of the Association of Families of Flight PS752 victims, I thank you for joining us today for this important milestone on our long and painful journey. 42 months have passed since the dawning of a civilian aircraft over the skies of Tehran. Flight PS752 was scheduled to depart from Tehran towards Kiev at 5:15 a.m. on January 8, 2020. The plane departed after a 57 minutes delay, the cause for which was never revealed. 3 minutes after takeoff, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard fired at least 2 missiles at the aircraft, and after a terrifying 3 minutes and 42 seconds for the passengers and crews, it crashed in Shahed Shahr, a town southwest of Tehran. What transpired during and after the missile attacks was unprecedented in the history of civil aviation in the world. It was the first time that the government took military action against civilian airlines after it's permitted to take off. The survivors of the victims face unimaginable challenges in their pursuit of justice, a pursuit that took vast amounts of relentless efforts until reaching a milestone such as today, some of which you have seen in the video. I can summarize as follows. The Islamic regime leaders murdered 177 civilians on the morning of January 8, disrespected their remains, looted their belongings, lied for 3 days until they were exposed, and ultimately made a mockery of justice by staging a show trials at an unqualified and partial military tribunal where an unknown man was only convicted of negligence and disobeying orders and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But today, the case for the dawning of Flight PS752 has been referred to the International Court of Justice by the 4 affected countries, namely Canada, the UK, Ukraine, and Sweden. The association tirelessly led the lengthy campaign to pursue our cause and reach this major milestone. Now the case is filed at both the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. The association made the ICC filing independently, and the 4 affected countries made a referral to the ICJ, and we support them in this important step. I must first thank everyone who stood with us thus far. I thank the 4 affected countries and their respective legal teams who have been so resolute along the way to find the truth and bring justice for the victims and their families. The association has repeatedly stated that our primary mission is truth and justice, and we expect the truth and justice remain the primary objectives going forward. We remain resolute on our other demands, such as support for the case that we brought to the International Criminal Court, initiating official criminal investigation by RCMP, cooperation with Ukrainian Prosecutor General, and most importantly, to finally list the nefarious Islamic Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization without delay. Truth and justice are the association's primary objectives because it will help to heal the society's wounds, especially those endured by the people of Iran. It will also help to put a stop to such crimes. The missile attacks against the Flight PS752 was not the Islamic regime's first crime. We are yet another link in the long chain of crimes committed by Islamic regime of Iran. From the burning of Abadan Rex cinema to the unlawful summary executions of former government officials shortly after revolution, to the brutal murders of innocent youth over the past 10 months, there seems to be no end to the criminality of this tyrannical regime. Over the past decades, such as the 80s, extensive atrocities have happened in Kurdistan and other Iranian provinces. Prisoners all around the country have been murdered while serving their sentences. Children were sent to the front lines of the war with Iraq that took so many lives. Widespread violence, crackdowns on student organizations, the Green Movement, and over 500 acts of terror, such as assassinations and bombings around the world, are just a few examples of the tyranny that has befallen Iranians. In November 2019, the silent murder of peaceful protesters took place, and the total number of victims are still unknown. 50 days later, missile attacks on Flight PS752 closed another link in the endless chain of crimes committed by Islamic regime. We believe that the referral of this case to the ICJ can coalesce the voices of thousands of other victims' families who have suffered so much injustice under that regime. We believe that any and all international pressure on the Islamic Republic regime with such a long history of murder and mayhem will ultimately benefit the democratic movement in Iran. Our mission has been to pursue justice for 177 of our loved ones, but our pursuit is in honor of thousands of other victims of tyranny in Iran. We shall never forget those behind these organized crimes, nor shall we ever forgive them. Thank you.
I now invite Nawaz Ibrahim, our next speaker from the association, to the stage. Nawaz is the president of the association and chair of the Public and Media Relations Committee.
سلام عرض می کنم خدمت همگی. خیلی ممنونیم از همه شما که امروز در اینجا حضور دارید و از همه کسانی که از هر جای دنیا امروز این مراسم را تماشا می کنید. قبل از سخنانم می خواهم یادی بکنم از تمامی قربانیان 44 سال دیکتاتوری جمهوری اسلامی و از همه شما از صمیم قلب تشکر کنم که ما را در این 42 ماه گذشته تنها نگذاشتید. ما تا رسیدن به آنچه دادخواهی می‌دانیم پا پس نخواهیم کشید. 42 ماه از سرنگون کردن یک هواپیمای مسافربری در آسمان تهران گذشت. پرواز PS752 قرار بود رأس ساعت 5 و 15 دقیقه تهران را به مقصد کیև در اوکراین ترک کند. این هواپیما با تأخیری 57 دقیقه‌ای که هیچگاه دلیل اصلی آن برای ما مشخص نشد، فرودگاه را ترک کرد. 3 دقیقه بعد از برخاستن از فرودگاه، این هواپیما با شلیک دست کم 2 موشک زمین به هوای سپاه پاسداران مواجه شد. و 3 دقیقه و 42 ثانیه بعد، پس از دقایق هولناکی که بر خدمه و مسافرین گذشت، در جنوب غربی تهران در شاهد شهر سقوط کرد. آنچه در هنگام وقوع جنایت و پس از آن اتفاق افتاد در تاریخ هوانوردی دنیا بی‌نظیر بود. اولین بار بود که یک حکومت به هواپیمای مسافربری خودی حمله نظامی می‌کرد و به همین دلیل پیگیری قضایی این پرونده بازماندگان فاجعه را گرفتار پیچیدگی‌های قانونی فراوانی کرد و تلاش فراوانی را طلبید تا به مقصدی چون امروز برسد و شما بخشی را در ویدیوی پخش شده ملاحظه کردید. اگر خلاصه بگویم، مقامات جمهوری اسلامی در سحرگاه روز 18 دی ماه 177 نفر را کشتند، به پیکرشان بی احترامی کردند، چمدانشان را دزدیدند، 3 روز دروغ گفتند و در نهایت پس از بیش از 3 سال در دادگاهی بی صلاحیت مردی بی نام و نشان را به جرم سهلنگاری و تمرد از دستور به 10 سال زندان محکوم کردند. اینک اما پرونده سرنگون کردن پرواز PS752 از سوی 4 دولت متضرر یعنی کانادا، اوکراین، بریتانیا و سوئد به مهمترین مرجع قضایی دنیا یعنی دیوان بین المللی دادگستری ارجاع شده است. ما در انجمن خانواده‌ها کارزاری وسیع و طولانی را برای رسیدن به این خواسته طی کردیم. اکنون پرونده پرواز PS752 در هر 2 دادگاه بین المللی موجود در دنیا مفتوح است. در دیوان بین المللی کیفری به طور مستقل شکایت کردیم و در دیوان بین المللی دادگستری با 4 کشور متضرر همراه هستیم. ابتدا از تلاش شبانه روزی همه کسانی که تا امروز با ما همراه بوده‌اند تشکر می‌کنیم. از دولت‌های متضرر و تیم حقوقی آنها تشکر می‌کنیم که این مسیر را برای رسیدن به حقیقت و عدالت با جدیت دنبال می‌کنند. انجمن خانواده‌ها بارها اعلام کرده است که حقیقت و عدالت اصلی ترین مأموریت اوست. پس انتظار داریم در مسیر پیش رو یافتن حقیقت و اجرای عدالت هدف اصلی باشد. همچنین برخواسته‌های دیگرمان چون حمایت از پرونده دیوان بین المللی کیفری، باز شدن پرونده جنایی توسط پلیس فدرال کانادا، همکاری با پرونده جنایی در دادستانی اوکراین و قرار دادن سپاه پاسداران انقلاب اسلامی در لیست گروه‌های تروریستی اصرار می‌ورزیم و امیدواریم این خواسته‌ها در اسرع وقت اجابت شوند. انجمن خانواده‌ها یافتن حقیقت و اجرای عدالت را مهمترین هدف می‌داند، چون هم به التیام زخم‌های جامعه به خصوص زخم‌های عمیق ایرانیان کمک خواهد کرد و همچنین باعث جلوگیری از تکرار چنین جنایاتی خواهد شد. شلیک به پرواز PS752 اولین جنایت جمهوری اسلامی نبود. ما خود را حلقه ای از زنجیره طولانی جنایات جمهوری اسلامی می‌دانیم که از سوزاندن تماشاگران در سینما رکس آبادان آغاز می شود، با اعدام مقامات حکومت پیشین بلافاصله بعد از بهمن 57 ادامه می یابد و به کشتار بیرحمانه جوانان ایران در 10 ماه گذشته ختم می گردد. در این فاصله و در دهه 60 کشتارهای گسترده‌ای در کردستان، برخی دیگر از نقاط کشور و در زندانها اتفاق می افتد. فرستادن کودکان و نوجوانان به جبهه جنگ با عراق رخ می دهد که جان بسیاری را می گیرد. سرکوب گسترده جنبش دانشجویی، جنبش سبز و انجام بیشتر از 500 ترور و بمبگذاری در خارج از کشور صورت می گیرد. در آبان 1398 و در کشتاری خاموش که هنوز تعداد قربانیان آن مشخص نیست، اوج می گیرد و 50 روز بعد از آن به پرواز PS752 می رسد. ما معتقدیم ارجاع این پرونده می تواند یک صدا شدن فریاد دادخواهی هزاران خانواده‌ای باشد که از ظلم این حکومت به جان آمده‌اند. ما معتقدیم هر گونه فشار بین المللی به جمهوری اسلامی که بیش از 4 دهه قتل و کشتار را در کارنامه خود دارد، در نهایت به سود جنبش دموکراسی خواهی در ایران تمام خواهد شد. ما این کارزار را به دادخواهی 177 نفر پیش برده ایم، اما آن را یادآور خاطره عزیز هزاران هزار قربانی می دانیم. ما عاملین و آمرین این جنایت سازمان یافته را نه فراموش می کنیم و نه می بخشیم.
Thank you, Navaz. I now invite Hamid Ismailion, former spokesperson for the association and a current member of the board of directors, as well as a member of the legal committee, to join us in our panel today. We are joined as our advisors on this panel by 3 legal experts who have shown the families of victims incredible support and kindness. The association has benefited from their volunteered legal advice in the last 42 months. The pursuit of justice without their contributions would not have been possible for the grieving families who were barely granted an opportunity to mourn the loss of their loved ones. I invite them to join us in our panel today, starting with Lysandra Novo, international human rights lawyer and a member of the legal team for the Article 15 communication. Kaveh Shahruz, lawyer, senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and human rights activist. Our next panelist is a senior associate attorney at Torrey's law firm. Torrey's firm has been a great supporter of the association cause in pursuit of justice and offered generously hours of volunteered legal advice to the association. I invite to join us on stage and for the panel, a champion of justice, Ryan Lax, senior associate attorney at Torrey's. Well, thank you all for being here today. We are limited on time, so I'm going to go straight to the questions. I like to start the first question by asking you a question, Hamid. What does the association expect from the proceedings and the referring of this case to the ICJ?
Hello everyone, thanks for joining here. Salam mikonam be hame azizan ke inja hastan. So as you have seen in the video and our statement, we have come a long way. It has been 42 difficult and painful months for all of us, and we faced a lot of complexities at the outset. That where should we go? Where a victim of terrorism can go to take the perpetrators of a crime. So we reviewed all the legal possibilities in front of us. One was International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, like public tribunals or people tribunals, and the other option was the legal proceeding in Iran. But all of us, we didn't believe that there's justice in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So that's why we had a legal committee, and we talked to all the lawyers that are here and some that they're not. And finally now we are very happy that we get to International Court of Justice.
Okay, we will talk about the other members of your legal committee that are not here and have assisted you, but I'd like to ask you the next question, Nabaz. What are some of the unanswered questions for the families?
Sure. As you know, there were a series of events that happened that night, and officials and government organizations in various levels were involved. For instance, the Supreme National Security Council, who had the authority to keep the airspace open during the war situation that night. We believe all who were involved need to be investigated and held accountable for what they did. But with all that being said, we also have some technical questions that we think actually responses to those questions will shed light on the truth. And we have listed this in our fact-finding report too, but I can start with our first demand, which is conducting a thorough and transparent investigation of the military aspects of the incident. And this is including investigating the Torem-1 system, the operator of the system, senior commanders of the IRGC and the Iranian Defense Network. And with the responses to these questions, we will get to all the details of what actually happened that night and the decision-making procedure on the military side. Next is the release of the content of the PS752's black boxes. As you know, the black boxes were held hostage by the Islamic Republic of Iran for almost 7 months, and to this day we don't have the full content, and only a shorter censored version of the content was released. More important than that is the content of the Torem-1 unit's black box. Also publishing the communications of the air traffic control towers with other relevant flights on that night. This is including Atlas Global Flight and Asaman Flight. Also the communication with the Civil Military Operational Coordination Center. In addition, analyzing the airport CCTV footage, and that will actually help us to find the true reason behind the delay of the flight. The passengers list, we need to know if anyone got off the plane for any reason. And these are actually all the information that Islamic Republic of Iran must have released to Ukraine as the owner of the plane. And with this information, they can actually interview with available witnesses and review all available site evidence.
And none of that has happened as of yet?
No.
Thank you very much. Kuresh, I'd like to ask you the next question. Who were the members of this legal committee for the association, and are there other members that are not here today that you'd like to mention before we dive deeper into our conversation?
Yes, of course. We have been fortunate to have many very expert in their field, in the legal fields, have been come forward and pro bono had helped us. And today, of course, we have Kaveh Shahruz here, and we have Ryan Lax is here too. But his senior partner, also John Tory, unfortunately couldn't join us today. And also we have David Matas, he's actually living in Winnipeg, and he's been contributing quite a bit. And Yana Diamond, as I mentioned before, and there's been Sarah Tish as well. And also we have others, like we have Lisandra Nova here, and she's helped us with the Article 15 submission to International Criminal Court. And of course, I should also mention Isunia, who's a lawyer, senior lawyer there, as well as the Heidi Dextal, who's been also part of this legal team. So we have been fortunate to have expert legal advice all along the way.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the next question from you, Ryan. In 1988, Iran Air Flight 655 was shot down by the U.S. military forces, and Iran did take that by U.S. Navy, I apologize, and then Iranian government took that case, referred that case to the ICJ. Could you tell us all a little bit about the proceedings, what happened, what came out of that case? Why did it fail?
For sure, and I'd like to start by thanking all of you for having me here today, and I wanted to communicate on behalf of the entire Torrey's law firm what a privilege it's been to work with the association since pretty much the early days of this, the beginning of this whole disaster, and truly all of our hearts go out to the entire community. Looking at some of the sort of analogies to this situation, because I do think the PS752 situation is also a little bit unique, but I understand why we're looking to some of the analogies. Iran Air 655, that was an incident where that Iran Air flight was shot down by the US Navy, as you mentioned, in the final days of the Iran-Iraq War in 1988. Iran started a proceeding before the ICJ in 1989, and it took 8 years to resolve, and it didn't even make its way through the full judicial process to a decision. What happened instead is it proceeded part way through the process and then the parties wound up negotiating a resolution before a decision was ultimately issued by the ICJ. Iran alleged before the ICJ, it argued before the ICJ that there were violations of both the 1944 Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation and the 1971 Montreal Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Civil Aviation. And I mention those only because those are still the two key international instruments that are at issue here. But the case brought by Iran before the ICJ was narrower than the one that we see Canada now bringing before the ICJ. It was essentially alleging that the United States needed to take responsibility for the incident and alleging that compensation was owed to Iran for the victims on the flight. And after about 8 years of proceedings before the ICJ, the parties spent about 2 years of negotiation in the aim of arriving at a final resolution, and they did ultimately arrive at a settlement. It was about $61 million in payments to victims' families, so that's about $210,000 US per passenger. And importantly, and I think we obviously want something different in this case, but there was no admission of liability on the part of the US or responsibility on the part of the US, and no formal apology on the part of the US to Iran.
And if you don't mind, would you please quickly elaborate on the two different types of conventions that the approach can take for everybody else's understanding, the Montreal and the Chicago Convention?
I'll stay at a little bit of a high level because this can be its own hour-long long international law lecture. But the 1994 Chicago Convention at a high level sets out key obligations to ensure the safe passage of aircraft through parties' airspace and to investigate incidents in the event of any type of crash. That convention was not designed specifically for the situation in which a state's armed forces shoots down a plane. It's much broader, but that is the high-level obligations set out in the Chicago Convention. The 1971 Montreal Convention is much more targeted, I'd say, and much more concretely applicable to this circumstance, in that it provides for specific obligations in respect of ensuring the safety of civilian aircraft, refraining from taking acts against civilian aircraft, and actual providing for the obligation to conduct criminal investigations in respect of any sort of incident that does occur.
So through this approach, non-financial compensation matters are discussed and become clear, hopefully, for the families.
It sets out a series of actual obligations to prosecute in a criminal manner any violations of the obligation to ensure safe passage of aircraft, basically.
Yeah, and the big picture goal here is to hopefully prevent from such things happening again in the future. Yeah. I do like to touch base on a couple other cases. Obviously, the case of Flight PS752 is quite unique, the circumstances of how it happened, but if we have time, I'd like to come back and talk to you a little bit about the Air India Flight 182 and the Pan Am 103, but hopefully we will have time for that. Okay. I'd like to ask the next question from you, Kaveh. The Islamic Republic tried 10 unknown individuals in relation to the PS752 case, and ultimately convicted the operator to 10 years imprisonment and on charges of negligence and refusal to obey orders. What do we know about that case? And is the Islamic Republic Military Tribunal really qualified to try this case?
That's a really great question and a very significant one for a reason that I'll touch on. But and I know time is tight, but let me just start by saying something a little bit unrelated, which is to the families. I want to say today is actually a happy day. I know it feels bittersweet, but let's focus on the sweet part. This is an incredible thing that has happened today, taking a case to the ICJ and bringing the Islamic Republic to a court, forcing it to answer for its crimes. This is really because of your work and the work of the folks on the stage that this incredible thing has happened. So congratulations to you. And I also want to thank members of the government, especially the public servants. In media interviews, on social media, and I know others are sometimes critical of what the government does, but it really does take a lot of effort to kind of stick handle this and take it to the place it's gotten. So to the government officials that have done this, thank you so much for your work in getting us this far. Now the question that you ask is a really important one. When you think about what a fair trial looks like, it's a trial that has the evidence out there to the extent that national security allows, out there for people to see. Stakeholders, primarily the victims and survivors, are consulted. There's an independent judiciary that assesses the evidence, and people have a chance to be heard and to understand how the trial worked. Now you look at what happened in the case in Iran with these 10 people. None of these things actually occurred. We barely know who the people are. The families were not consulted. In fact, they were often kept in the dark. They were under confidentiality orders and they were harassed and detained when they wanted more information. Iran's judiciary, and particularly its military tribunals, are notoriously at the mercy of, they're notoriously political institutions. So they are not independent. They can't do any of the things that they're supposed to do. So I put no value and credence in the process that played out, and I think that the families have dismissed it, rightly so. The reason I think it's such a significant question, though, is that Iran will try to play this card. This has happened in the past. There's only one other sort of close analog that I can think of in the International Court of Justice, which is the Lockerbie case involving Libya. And Libya dragged out this argument for many years, saying, look, we've already tried people in our Libyan courts. And I suspect that Iran is going to say the same thing. They're going to say, look, there are domestic remedies. There is a court in Iran. The argument that the Canadian government has to make, and others, and I'm very happy to see this was actually alluded to in the application, is that this was basically a sham trial. There's no value, there is no domestic remedy to think about. It's really the international system that can provide answers.
It is very hard to believe for people who are not familiar with how the judiciary system in Iran
Absolutely.
works to really understand how shambolic those courts have been. Lysandra, I'm going to ask you the next question. The PS752 Victims Association also independently submitted a file to the International Criminal Court on September 14th of 2022. Where does that case stand, and what basis was it filed under?
Thank you, Pega. First, I also want to thank you all for having me here today. Gisu and Ide send their deepest regrets that they could not join you, but I'm honored to be here representing the team.
She is missed. Thank you.
So first, I'd actually like to explain what an Article 15 communication is, and it's something that allows anyone, an individual, group, organization, to submit information and evidence to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court regarding crimes under the Rome Statute. So what the association provided was information regarding the crimes that were committed on board Flight PS752. And the reason that they allege this can come forward before the Office of the Prosecutor is that Flight PS752 was an aircraft registered to Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is not a state party to the Rome Statute, but it has lodged 2 declarations accepting the jurisdiction of the court for any crimes committed in any part of its territory since November 2013. Because these crimes were committed on board Flight PS752, an aircraft registered to Ukraine, which forms part of its territory, all these crimes were committed on the territory of Ukraine. Now, where the case stands, the Office of the Prosecutor has acknowledged that it received the submission. When the Office of the Prosecutor receives an Article 15 communication, it takes a long time to thoroughly review all of the information and the evidence. It does this with every case, and I think, as you mentioned earlier, this submission was very lengthy. It was nearly 100 pages of legal analysis and hundreds of pages of evidence that were submitted. So naturally, it will take the court a long time to review this. Our hope is that once the Office of the Prosecutor reviews this evidence, that they will include these crimes in the investigation of the situation in Ukraine. Because there is already an ongoing investigation here, there is no need to open a preliminary examination. These could be included in the already opened investigation.
Okay, thank you very much. Both you, Kaveh, and Ryan, I'd like to ask your personal and professional opinion about to what extent do you believe the family's expectations can be met through this referral to the ICJ?
Want to go?
Sure. The ICJ, I wrote something about this just a little bit earlier today. The ICJ is not the perfect forum for this, I concede. The International Criminal Court, which, the file you're working on, or a fair, impartial domestic criminal court would be places where the families are much more likely to get real justice. They're much more likely, obviously, to get somebody in the defendant's box, to actually send someone to prison for the horrendous crime that was committed. Alas, we don't live in an ideal world, and we have to deal with what is possible. And I think the ICJ is probably the best available forum at the moment for the families to take their claim. And looking at the application, I was very pleasantly surprised when I received the application today that Canada is asking for the truth. It's asking for apologies from the Iranian government. It's asking for a great many things that I think would go a long way in addressing the family's demands for justice. Not perfection, but probably the best in a weak international system.
Thank you. And how do you build on that?
I agree with that. I think it's the ICJ, everybody needs to understand, is a court that resolves disputes regarding states' obligations under international law. It does not have the ability to interfere directly or direct specific domestic processes that need to take place. So it cannot, for example, conduct its own criminal or fact-finding investigation into the crash, and it cannot enforce criminal penalties. But what we can get from the ICJ, because we do have fairly strong international law to build on here, chiefly the 1971 Montreal Convention that enacts a host of obligations that states have to both safeguard international civilian air travel and then conduct criminal investigations that are meaningful, transparent, independent, etc. When an incident does arise, and I should say there's also an obligation to cooperate with other countries in conducting those investigations. There is a real possibility to get from the ICJ a finding that Iran has not upheld its obligations to do all of this, that Iran has not safeguarded the PS752, which I think is obvious to all of us. But beyond that, that Iran has not upheld its obligation under the 1971 Montreal Convention to conduct a thorough, independent, proper criminal investigation and prosecution, and that Iran has not cooperated with other countries, chiefly Ukraine, which is the country of aircraft registration, to conduct their criminal investigations as well. And so that relates to the discussion around sham trials and what we all know to be true, that Iran hasn't properly investigated and disclosed the underlying facts here. And there's a real possibility that the ICJ will hold that. And just my own view is that, in Iran's fact-finding report, that leaps off the page in at least one glaring respect, where they've excluded from the scope of their own investigation all machinations internal to the military, which seems to be the center of this issue here. So to me, it shouldn't actually require that much persuasion, but I clearly...
it obviously does.
I'm no longer unbiased on this.
Yeah, that's actually says something hearing it from you. Lysandra, how do you think the ICC case will contribute to this outcome? Do you think it can sort of contribute to what we can expect to see from ICJ?
Well, I think as my colleagues have mentioned on stage, this is really about pursuing these parallel processes, and I commend the association for really going for all of the avenues available to it. And so while the ICJ reviews state legal responsibility, the ICC can really go into individual criminal accountability. And so here, the Office of the Prosecutor would really, if it chooses to proceed, conduct its own fact-finding investigation and make its own determinations about which crimes were committed and which crimes can be charged under the Rome Statute, as well as identifying individual perpetrators that could be brought to the court for future cases. And so I think this really also goes to the two prongs that the association pursues for truth and justice.
Thank you very much. Brian, we know this case was filed through 4 countries that had citizens on that flight, but we know there were passengers that were not citizens of any of those countries, such as the Iranian citizens and Afghan citizens. Is there any path for reparation for citizens of countries outside of those 4?
So
through the ICJ, I mean through this. Yeah.
It's a good question, and honestly, it's a complicated question. I think no matter what the findings made by the ICJ in respect of Iran's responsibility will apply equally to, and I should say Iran's failure to uphold its international legal obligations, those will apply equally in respect of all passengers on PS752, regardless of nationality. Where we get into a little bit more of a tricky analysis is where you're looking for aspects of individual relief. And the 4 affected countries that have filed this application have asked for an order for forms of compensation and reparations that may flow down to forms of international relief through those, individual relief through those governments. It may be possible for Afghanistan to negotiate a similar form of resolution flowing from the decision for its nationals. In respect of citizens who are only citizens of Iran, the question is more complicated because Iran doesn't owe the same sort of obligations under international law, arguably, to its own citizens. Those are obligations owed to foreign governments and the citizens of those foreign countries. We anticipate that in respect of dual citizens, where Iranians hold another nationality, there will be a bit of a debate about the responsibility of the government of Iran to pay reparations to foreign governments in respect of dual nationals. Okay. And I just don't think we can predict about how that's going to play out at this point in time.
Yeah, for sure. You did correspond with the RCMP on behalf of the association, and you were present in meetings with former Commissioner Lucky. How do you find the RCMP's response and actions in this case? Ukraine's prosecutor general is the only agency, really, that opened a criminal case. Wouldn't the RCMP be able to initiate independent criminal proceedings, especially since Ukraine is now marred by the war and there is foreign aggression happening in that country?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a tough question.
Yes.
I should say it's one that there is no clean, clear, obvious answer to at this point in time, but there are arguments around it that can be made. The framework that we're dealing with here is that under the 1971 Montreal Convention, which I keep coming back to, the 2 countries have primary responsibility for criminal investigation and prosecution, and that is unfortunately the country of the location of the crash, which is Iran, and the country of the registration of the aircraft, which is Ukraine. For various reasons that you've mentioned, either Iran's unwillingness to conduct a proper investigation, and Ukraine's obvious circumstances being occupied with other matters at this point in time. Those don't appear to be rolling forward as quickly, and so we have, or in the manner we'd hoped. So we have had many discussions with the RCMP over the last couple years, and there is a potential interpretation of a portion of Canada's criminal code that may leave open the possibility for a domestic investigation. Honestly, it's an interpretation of these provisions of the criminal code that have never been tested before. In part, it's because this provision of the criminal code expressly exempts from its scope the activities of any foreign military. There is potentially an argument that the activities of military officers or of a military that do not take place within the structure of a formal order or the formal acts of the military should not be protected by that particular provision, as is arguably the case here. But it is a bit of an uncertain interpretation within Canadian law. And I will say, in assessing the RCMP's actions to date, we obviously don't have complete knowledge. As with any investigation process, these matters are confidential, and so I'm a little bit working on limited knowledge of what I have, but I have not. The general impression that I've received from them is that they see their role more as supporting the Ukrainian investigation than conducting their own. They don't see themselves as leading on this issue, which I think is a little bit disappointing given the potential avenues that are open to them. But there may be information that I'm not aware of that indicates otherwise.
Okay, thank you. Speaking of disappointment, I'm going to address the next question to you, Kaveh. The Canadian government considers the Islamic Republic a state that sponsors terrorism. Why do you think that the IRGC, that is directly implicated and responsible for the downing of Flight PS752, as well as many other countless crimes, it is not officially declared as a terrorist organization yet?
That's a great question, and I wish I had a good answer for you, but I don't. So as you know, a lot of us in this room have worked very hard and have been advocates for listing the IRGC as a terror organization. I don't think I have to sell the argument to anyone here. All you need to do is just look at the record of the IRGC and the number of people it has killed, not only inside the country, but abroad. So I think there's a very compelling case that it is a terror organization. There are complexities. Regrettably, there are people that are conscripted into the IRGC, and some of them who have reached out to me, I know them. The US designated the IRGC as a terror organization, and they didn't carve out the conscripts, and so life has been made very difficult for them. But I think that's a very solvable issue. Why Canada has not listed them, I suspect some of it has to do with this legal complexity around conscripts. Some of it has to do probably with political considerations involving whether or not you can bring Iran back into the fold through a nuclear agreement and so on, and listing the one of the main arms of the Iranian regime as a terror organization would make that difficult. Frankly, like, my criticism of the Canadian government on this is not, obviously it's why have you not done this, but more so, why is the government not being transparent on this? If there is a reason, if there is and I've inquired at every level that I can, and no one has been able to give me a very good legal, rational, political, even policy reason for why this hasn't been done. So this is obviously an issue that we're going to have to, both legally, but I think more importantly politically, put pressure on the government to take better steps on.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'd like to ask the three of you, how do you assess the role that the association has played, and obviously that of the victims' families, in affecting the legal proceedings so far? I can start with you.
Sure. I would say that for us, first of all, I again commend the families for their incredible job with the fact-finding report. It is incredibly thorough, and the analysis provided by the various experts was incredibly helpful in forming our submission and our assessment of what possible crimes under the Rome Statute could have happened. And given the difficulty in accessing any information about what actually happened, for us it was incredibly helpful to have this invaluable resource provided by the families.
Great, thank you. And what do you think, Ryan?
I think there's been substantial fruit. I realize that has been born from the association's efforts to date. I won't go into all of it, but I just want to harken back to the early days of our work together, where we were in many discussions, as you'll all recall, with the officials from the Government of Canada, who were, I think, very well-meaning, but trying to understand what the victims' families really sought from this situation. And many times there was a question posed to us, well, what could you possibly want or hope for beyond, you know, some form of compensation paid, which has obviously been a very different frame of thinking than the one we've adopted over our work together over the last years. And I just want to, I haven't had the chance to fully digest the submission that was released this morning to the ICJ, but I do want to take a moment to note that the forms of relief and the case that is being advanced by Canada, the UK, Sweden, Ukraine, is very different and much more in line with the association's aims from the last 4 years. And I don't think that is in any small part because of the tireless work that this group has done. Right now, those 4 countries are asking for declarations that Iran violated the Montreal Convention by failing to take all practicable measures to prevent the destruction of PS752. It failed to conduct a prompt, effective, independent, impartial investigation. It failed to submit the case in good faith to competent authorities to prosecute. It failed to cooperate with other countries in their own investigations. It failed to report transparently to ICAO. And it's asking, the 4 countries are asking for orders that Iran publicly acknowledge its internationally wrongful acts and omissions, publicly apologize, provide assurances against repetition of the same conduct in the form of future concrete measures that are implemented to avoid it in the future, which will of course involve an area or an element of addressing the military's role in all of this and the command structure. And those are just a few. I'm not going to go on and on, but I think there has been a substantial role that the association has played, and all of the victims' family members in shaping that agenda. Before I've spoken a lot on this point, but before I stop, I will also just mention one other element that I think we had some success in shaping from a few years ago, and that was the investigation by Dr. Agnes Callamard, the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and or arbitrary executions. And if you have the opportunity to read her report, I would say we met with her on a few occasions to help her understanding of this entire situation. And she released a 40 or 50 page report a few years ago that was, I think, the real first authoritative statement from an international authority in this case, finding that Iran had failed to uphold its human rights obligations in this case. And failed to essentially protect the passengers of PS752's right to life.
Thank you. What about you, Gada?
You know, my colleagues have said everything I want to say, so I don't take much time in answering this. Earlier this morning, some of us were exchanging emails in anticipation of this, and this point was made exactly, which is the families did an incredible job. Had the families not been as involved and as skilled in sort of maneuvering, this application may never have happened. I think a lot of these countries that are involved would have been perfectly happy, and it might have been easier for them, less of a headache for them, to just negotiate with Iran, get some compensation, get some money, and let it go. The families didn't allow that to happen. The families kept emphasizing that they want truth and they want accountability. And the application and all the things that Ryan read, those are demands from the families, and they would not have worked their way, I don't think, into the application had the families not been so involved. So really kudos to you.
And all through COVID.
All through COVID, incredibly. Yeah.
Another important fact, I guess. Well, Alessandra, I'm going to ask you a question about, you know, whether you believe it's reasonable to expect that maybe the 4 affected countries or even the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to support the association's filing at the ICC and initiate preliminary investigations.
Well, thank you for that question. As I said earlier, the preliminary examination is actually not a hurdle here because there is already an ongoing investigation of the situation in Ukraine. And because the flight was registered to Ukraine, this could fit very easily within that existing investigation. As far as the other countries, we have encouraged both the affected countries, but really any state party to the Rome Statute can support this submission. And we encourage these states to really support this before the Office of the Prosecutor and fully engage with the case.
Thank you. Kaveh, I'm going to ask you this question. The families demand to see the principal leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran to be accused and to stand trial. Can there only be true justice for the PS752 case when the Iranian regime is overthrown and fair and independent trials can be held in Iran, would you say?
Inside
Iran?
I would say that. I'm going to take off my lawyer hat for a minute and put on my political activist hat. I was once doing a radio interview with Hamid, and somebody asked him a very similar question. And Hamid said, well, there can't be justice in this case. Justice would be for his wife and his daughter to come home. That's not going to happen, unfortunately. The closest thing we can get is to figure out who ordered those shots to be fired, put that person in the defendant's box, and put them in prison. Regrettably, because of the structure of the international system, because of the power that the Iranian regime has, and so on and so forth, that can't be done until such time that this regime is overthrown, that there are fair, impartial courts in Iran that can hold these people to account. So this is really one of those places where law and politics meet. And regrettably, the law at the moment can't offer you the closest thing to justice. For that, there is a political revolution underway, which we should all support, because that's the best way to get justice, not just for PS752, but for all the victims that Kurosh and others spoke about. This, you keep referring to this as a link in the chain of crimes, and I think that's a brilliant metaphor for what's happened. And in order to get justice for that whole chain, there will have to be a significant political change in that country.
Thank you. Let's all hope for that. I'm going to address this question to both of you, Ryan and Kaveh. It was very encouraging for the association to see the appointment of Professor Akhavan, former prosecutor of the United Nations, as a member of the advisory board for the 4 affected countries. We also know that Sir Michael Wood, Professor Harold Hongju Ko, and Ms. Jessica Wells are the other members of the advisory board appointed by these 4 affected countries. Given their experience, should we be optimistic that they will pursue truth and justice above all else through this submission?
I mean, so that's a big question. Of course, it certainly is a sign, or is an indicator of optimism for me, or a reason that I am optimistic. They are all highly knowledgeable, highly qualified individuals. I do sort of commend Canada for appointing some representatives in this field as an advisory board that really are leaders and leading thinkers in guiding this issue. But with that said, I don't think it's a reason for us to rest on our laurels in any way. They are lawyers, they are advisors. It is still 4 governments who are calling the shots and guiding these proceedings. And so even though the government has assembled a strong team to help carry this issue, that's not a reason for us to rest, and that's not a reason for anybody to sit back and trust that it's being taken care of. Lawyers act on the instructions of their clients. The clients are the governments, and so it remains important for us to keep engaging with Canada and the other 3 governments leading the charge on this to ensure that there is appropriate importance or pressure being placed on this issue to keep advancing it.
What do you think about this, Kaveh?
Yeah, so your question was, do I feel assured that they're going to pursue justice? I feel absolutely assured that people like Professor Akhavan or Professor Ko and others are going to pursue justice. They're decent people, moral people, and experts in the field. As Ryan said, though, ultimately it's the governments that get to make that call. And here I would really advise the families, just as Ryan did, don't take your foot off the gas. Stay focused, keep the pressure on. And I know that there are a lot of efforts to create fractures in the unity of the association. And here, I really want to implore you to keep that unity, because it's that unity that has been really the basis of a lot of pressure on various governments to take these important steps.
Okay, thank you very much. I do have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to have to be a little picky about what I ask you here. Do you have any final remarks, maybe, or some remarks something that hasn't been covered, Hamid, that you want us to touch base on? I do have a couple other questions I can ask, but I thought you've been quite quiet today.
No, actually, as Kaveh said, the unity of the families was very important. Like, look at the application this morning and see what the families in Iran did. I mean, the way they got united and they withdrew from the case, that they didn't believe was a fair trial. I think that was very important. Imagine that 70 people, they go together to the court and they withdraw their application and they say, we don't see any justice in the judiciary system in Iran. So you know that we are representing the families of 140 victims, and it's important to know that lots of our members are in Iran. Yeah. To keep everybody on the same page and decide together, I think this is an absolute teamwork. And this is very important for us, and as you said, as you recommended, we have to keep doing the same thing that we have done for the last 42 months.
For sure. I'd like to build on what you just said. Kaveh, maybe this is a good question for me to ask you. The association's fact-finding report concluded that the crime was intentional. Do you believe that setting a reward for witnesses or even referring the case to the ICJ now would potentially encourage some witnesses to maybe step forward and maybe testify about the crimes that have happened?
My view of that, and I defer actually to my litigator colleague Ryan here, I'm not a litigator. My view is that it can't possibly hurt. I mean, it's a further incentive for people to come forth, whether they're motivated by the reward or whether their conscience is bothering them because they're sitting on some explosive evidence. I think it would be helpful, and I think the intentionality would help a lot of different cases, the ICJ case, the ICC case, presumably. So to the extent that there is, if there is a smoking gun out there, if there is a witness out there, if there's a document out there, any way that you can provide motivation for people to come forth with that, I think would be good. But I don't know.
What do you think about that?
I mean, my general attitude in all of these cases, and in all cases that I have, is I'd rather know more than less. So the information certainly can't hurt our cause, and I definitely would want people to feel like they can come forward with the appropriate safeguards and protections. I don't want anybody in Iran to feel like they are putting themselves at undue risk as well, and they need to, every individual honestly needs to weigh those considerations with their own comfort. But we are always receptive to any information anybody would like to provide.
Okay. Before we open to the Q&A section of today's panel, I'm going to ask you maybe one last question about this recent events that Iran filed, the Islamic Republic filed an unrelated complaint against Canada at the ICJ one day before the PS752 arbitration deadline. In your opinion, would this have any bearing on this case? And whether or not this is similar to the hostage diplomacy that we've seen from the Islamic regime in the past?
Great question. My hope is that it will not affect the case. The ICJ is an independent body. The judges are independent. They're professionals. They should not be affected by this kind of maneuvering. Iran's claim is that Canada has undermined the doctrine of state immunity by allowing people to take Iran to court or try to seize its assets. Is there an argument to be made there? Presumably there is, but I don't think Iran is making that argument or starting this claim in good faith. It's obviously intended as a sort of a reaction to this. And as you say, I mean, Iran, regrettably, Iran's regime has a habit of engaging in hostage diplomacy. Often it does this with actual people that it holds as hostages. We've seen this play out recently in Europe where they exchanged an aid worker, a Belgian aid worker who had been held for no reason in exchange for like a known terrorist. So they engaged in this. This seems to be the legal equivalent to that. It's, you're going to take an action against us, we're going to concoct some story and start a claim against you. But I'm hopeful that the ICJ will see through it.
Okay. If I could just add one word on that. I think there's also an element where they've seen past conduct, they've negotiated past resolutions to these issues short of an ICJ decision in the past. I'd be surprised if they weren't filing their own claim against Canada in view of having some leverage and some asks of their own in a negotiation down the road if this is not taken through to judicial conclusion at the ICJ.
But they did not really follow the typical path to file for the ICJ case either. So do you think there is any even possibility of this going forward?
I honestly, I haven't reviewed the claim in enough detail to opine on that. There's not one typical path to the ICJ. Each international instrument that you are acting under contains its own dispute resolution clause that sets out its own path, and Iran's claim is just different and acting under different international law than the four affected countries under the 1971 Montreal Convention here.
Okay. Well, I do like to ask if anybody has any final remarks that you want to make before we open for questions and answers.
I'd actually like to add just on this last question as well that each of these cases before the ICJ, it's a separate and distinct case, as well as this case that Canada and the affected countries have brought forth. It's different parties because it consists of different states. The facts at issue are different, and the legal obligations that the judges will be asked to evaluate are different. So while I can't speak as to any political motivations of bringing the case, I can say that certainly before the ICJ, these would be treated as two different cases with different questions, facts, and analyses that the judges have to carry out.
Very good. Thank you very much. You have been quite quiet too through the, if you have any final remarks, we would love to hear it.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm sure many people were happy I'm quiet today. And has been a day for quite a reflection and looking back to see where we started and where we are today. It's been a difficult journey, and it's been really, really painful for all of us. But we carried on, we stayed loyal to each other, we worked together, and we cried together, but we are here. And we decided from the very beginning, don't allow this case in Canada or other places to become political. We avoided all the resemblance of sort of a partisan bickering and all of that. We worked, we created a very dynamic cooperation with the government of Canada, and we tried with the other governments to work with each other. And we did, whenever it was necessary, we also criticized, but we continue to work. And today, in the audience, I just want to thank Mr. Farid, Sora Farid here, and Arash as well. They are in the task force, PS752 task force. They have done a lot of work and in cooperation with the families. And I really wanted to acknowledge them today.
Thank you.
And I appreciate that.
The room is definitely emotionally charged. It's, I found myself struggling through the first things I said today, so it's a big day for the families. What about you, Nabaz? Do you have anything you want to add?
Sure, I just want to congratulate everyone. This has been definitely a teamwork, and I don't think we would be sitting here if the families hadn't found each other and stick together during this very difficult time. And we all work together to accomplish this, and this is just the beginning, and we need to continue staying focused and push forward to hopefully find the truth and justice for our loved ones.
For sure. What about you, Ahmed?
Same thing, and I just want to appreciate the presence of the families of other atrocities that the Islamic regime has committed in the last 44 years. They're here, and we fight for the same goal. I think this case can show just a little bit of the picture of future Iran. The transitional justice is very important for Iranians, and they want to see how is the picture of justice in future Iran. I think this could have been one of the starters. We have seen a court of Hamid Nouri last year. There were other activities, and we know that the UN Human Rights Commission has started. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to see their first report this morning, but I know that all these activities are important, and that would be helpful for future Iran, a democratic Iran.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think we now open to the members of the press. Anybody who wants to start, please go ahead. If you could please introduce yourself. Just allow the microphone to get to you. Thank you. And maybe mention where you are here from.
I'm from Iran International. My name is Mahsa Mortazavi. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask my question. If we can consider Canada the main country who is affected by downing Flight PS752, and that now the fact Iran is taking this matter to the ICJ separately, can it affect the force that Canada is putting into resolving this issue in ICJ?
I want to say, do you want to address
Yeah, I mean,
first?
that's a good question. I alluded to it earlier. My hope is that the judges at the ICJ will keep the two cases separate, and hopefully, what they will be able to see is that Iran's case has not been commenced in good faith. There might be a dispute there, but there was no negotiation, there was no discussion. And the timing seems to suggest that really it's intended as retaliation, or as my colleague Ryan mentioned, as just a bargaining chip once the negotiations begin. So I hope that the answer to your question is no, that they will not be affected.
And I believe the other lawyers also, you resonate with that response, both of you, okay? Go ahead.
Question. I understand that the judges will look into this as two different cases, but however, Canada as a state who is partially involved in this dispute can be affected by the case and how it's been addressed in the ICJ. Will it force the government of Canada to look into it differently?
I don't want to speculate as to what the government of Canada will do. I mean, you should speak to their representatives, obviously. But my hope is that the Canadian government realizes that that's a sham. That claim that Iran has brought is a sham. It's not been launched in good faith. And my hope is that the families stay united and keep their activism going, such that the political pressure on the government continues, and they don't abandon this case in the hopes of sort of winning the other case.
Yeah, I think there's a clear role for the families in the community here in helping the government realize that it shouldn't be intimidated by or compromise in the face of this second claim.
Okay, thank you all. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Samira Moyedin from CBC. I have a question about how much you're looking to the MH17 case, and are you taking any sort of lessons from that?
I believe, Ryan, you want to answer that?
The answer is in parts, and it's certainly something we are watching, but there's also distinguishing features around it as well. The forum in which that dispute is being addressed is different, and the basis for it is different because it all happened within Europe. So there's some instruction that's or some lessons that can guide us, but as I mentioned, I think one of the first things I said was PS752 is a little bit its own unique situation, and so we're treating it. There's no one template to follow.
For sure. Kaveh, do you want to maybe address that
Honestly,
situation?
I think Ryan's answer is as good as anything I would say. The lawyer's role is to find similarities where helpful and distinguish where not helpful, and I think obviously we're following the case, but and drawing lessons, but that's
I'm asking what those lessons are, because there are similarities. So I'm asking what they are.
Yeah. To build on your questions, I actually had a question I didn't get a chance to ask you, so I'm now going to ask that same question. So the MH17 case has been referred to the ICAO, and it appears that the arbitration period between Netherlands and Australia against Russia has come to a dead end. So the affected countries have shown indication that the PS752 case will, in a parallel legal path, be pursued through the ICAO Council. What is your prediction of the results of this legal avenue, and do you expect that the file to be referred to ICJ separately?
Yeah, that's a great question, and my colleagues may have different views on it. ICAO is a different beast than the ICJ. The ICAO is a political body. ICAO has government representatives on it. And so, what plays out with respect to PS752 will depend in large part on kind of the politics. Earlier, I was talking to somebody who's familiar with this and was mentioning that, the change that's happening in the council, I think it's coming in 2024, 2025, will actually, impact the way this case will play out. And so, I think all you can do is continue to pressure, to continue to meet with ambassadors at ICAO. I know the families have done that. I've been party to some of those meetings. And just keep pressure on them in the hopes that ICAO will address the case fairly, and if it doesn't, then the next path is again another ICJ submission under a different convention.
Yeah. Just for clarity, there's a while at the beginning of our remarks, we mentioned that there's two applicable conventions: the 1971 Montreal Convention and the 1944 Chicago Convention on Civil Aviation. The Chicago Convention requires that the matters be brought to ICAO before the ICJ, so we don't have a particular insight into the affected country's plans under the Chicago Convention, but it would be the next step to bring any matters that fall outside of the current application to ICAO first, and then to the ICJ. But we just don't have insight into plans at this point in time.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Hi, this is Puriya Afkami representing Radio Liberty, Radio Farda. I would like to ask my question in Persian.
For sure, go ahead.
جواب اسماعیلیون، میخواستم بپرسم که با توجه به ارجاع این پرونده به دیوان بین‌المللی دادگستری در لاهه، به نظر شما این تغییر چه تأثیری میتونه روی فعالیت‌های انجمن بذاره؟ ممنون میشم.
So I'm just going to reiterate the question in English for some of the audience that do not speak Farsi. The question was, do you believe that this submission to the ICJ will affect the activities of the association?
I would like to have the answer in Persian.
For sure.
For our version.
For sure.
You translate my answer too?
After you're done, I'm going to try to make a note, or feel free to then repeat your own response in English.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead.
So, ببینید بعد از این مرحله که انجام میشه مسیر کوتاهی نخواهد بود. میدونم که مثلا در 10 ماه گذشته خب خیلی انجمن خانواده ها درگیر انقلابی بود که در ایران داشت رخ میداد، ولی ما به طور موازی داشتیم این پرونده رو پیش میبردیم. یعنی همزمان در ماهای اکتبر، نوامبر، تابستان گذشته برامون مهم بود، چون کاری بود که 3 سال براش زحمت کشیده بودیم و میخواستیم به نتیجه برسه و الان هم همینطوره. در عین حال که انجمن تمام امکاناتش رو در اختیار انعکاس صدای مردم ایران قرار داد، به نظر من در آینده هم باید بسیار متمرکز باشه بر کاری که در این فایل انجام میشه. اتفاقا حالا دوست داشتم که از دوستانی که اینجا هستن پگاه میتونه سوال بکنه که در واقع تایملاین یا در واقع زمانی که صرف خواهد شد برای این پرونده چقدر خواهد بود. ما داریم از سالها حرف میزنیم، از ماهها حرف نمیزنیم. بنابراین این مهمه که ما همچنان متمرکز بر این پرونده به عنوان اولین وظیفه که داریم باقی بمونیم.
So do you want me to quickly just mention
Please.
that you mentioned that it will not be a short path, and that the same way that the association was heavily involved in the revolution, the Mahsa revolution, Jina Amini's revolution in Iran, the same way the association will continue to utilize all its resources in reflecting the voices of people within Iran. But obviously the focus will remain on the pursuit of justice in every aspect. I try to be very concise. We will go back as a final question and talk about an expected date in court. I will definitely close with that. Please go ahead, your turn.
Okay. My name is Mohammad Taj Dolati. I'm from Persian Mirror Online magazine. With my apologies to two panelists, not as non-Farsi speaking, but I want to ask my question in Farsi.
Go ahead.
سوال من از حامد اسماعیلیون عزیز و سخنگوی کنونی انجمن هست. شما در طول این 3 سال و نیم گذشته تلاش کردید که پرونده دادخواهی PS752 رو وصل کنید و به درستی گره بزنید به پرونده دادخواهی 44 ساله مردم ایران. با انقلاب مهسا این حرکت در بسیاری صدها هزار ایرانی در خارج از کشور ایجاد شد و اینها پیوستند به این حرکت دادخواهی. اتفاقاتی افتاد در طول این چند ماه گذشته و الان ما در یک فاز خاموش انقلاب مهسا هستیم و همه چی نشون میده که دیر یا زود دوباره این انقلاب از ایران دوباره این زبانه سر خواهد کشید و مردم دوباره احساساتشون برانگیخته خواهد شد. سوال من دقیقاً این هستش که انجمن چه درسی از این تجربه ماهای گذشته گرفته برای اینی که در آینده‌ای که دیر یا زود خواهد اومد بتونه به درستی اون انگیزه رو دوباره در مردم که همیشه حمایت کردن از پرونده دادخواهی دوباره ایجاد بکنه که با اون انرژی مثبتی که با این قدمی که امروز برداشته شده و یک امید تازه ایجاد شده بتونه این حرکت دادخواهی رو در میان افکار عمومی همچنان زنده و پرحرارت نگه داره. مرسی.
ببینید من فکر میکنم که من مادرای عزیز پرواز اینجا نشستن، خیلی هاشون هیچ کدومشون سالهای اول رو فراموش نمیکنن، در بهت و شوکی که به سر میبردند از فاجعه‌ای که اتفاق افتاده بود. ولی من میتونم بگم که ما الان در این انجمن 10 ها مبارز داریم و شما سخنرانی‌های مادرها، همسرها، در واقع وابستگان، تمام اقوام در واقع مسافرین رو در جای جای جهان می‌بینید. فکر کنم یکی از مهمترین کارهایی بوده که انجمن در کنار هم ما انجام دادیم، اینکه این حس جنگیدن رو به هم دیگه در واقع القا بکنیم که ما باید بجنگیم و با ایستادن با افسردگی نتیجه حاصل نخواهد شد. در آینده هم همین خواهد بود. من به طور کلی در مورد وضعیت ایران اساساً احساس ناامیدی ندارم. شما تصویری که از ایران دارید می‌بینید، به خصوص در چند ماه گذشته، مبارزه‌ای که زنان دارن میکنن، جوانان میکنن، بی‌نظیره و این ایران رو تغییر خواهد داد. چندین بارم گفتم در گذشته، انقلاب در ایران با ما و بدون ما اتفاق میفته. ما اگر بتونیم کمک بکنیم و صدای مردم رو به درستی منعکس بکنیم در خارج از کشور با امکاناتی که داریم، مثلا اگر پریروز ما شنیدیم که توماج صالحی متاسفانه اتهامات سنگینی بهش بستند، پیش از این که اتفاقی بیفته ما باید فریاد بزنیم، باید با هر امکانی که داریم صدای خانواده توماج باشیم. من امیدوارم که امروز بعد از ظهرم ساعت 5 مردم اینجا حضور پیدا بکنن و فکر میکنم از بستگان توماج هم در این شهر هستن که بخوان صحبت بکنن. ولی ما همه نه تنها در مورد توماج که یک قهرمانه در چشم ما، ولی بسیاری از جوانانی که در 10 ماه گذشته از به دست جمهوری اسلامی کشته شدند و خانواده هاشون قهرمانان ما هستن، ما اونها رو نباید تنها بگذاریم.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions from the press? Oh, go ahead, please, Gurush.
مرسی از اینکه سوال پرسیدید. فکر کنم جوابی که حامد داد خیلی کامل بود، ولی چیزی که من میتونم اضافه کنم، ما همون روزای اول که این فاجعه اتفاق افتاد به این نتیجه رسیدیم که تنها راهی که ممکن هست واسه خانواده ها که بتونیم به اصطلاح مبارزه کنیم با این ظلم و این بی‌عدالتی اینه که دور هم جمع بشیم، سازماندهی کنیم، خودمون به سازمان بدیم، به اصطلاح یک سازمانی به وجود بیاریم که این نتیجه شد انجمنی که الان شما می‌بینید. و این واقعیتش اینه که میتونه به عنوان یه مثال باشه واسه تمام دادخواهان. و دلیلی که من اینو میذارم مثلا صحبت میکنم اینه که این همه جنایت در عرض 44 سال گذشته به اصطلاح از طریق جمهوری اسلامی انجام شده، ولی متاسفانه هیچ کدوم از کسایی که این جنایات در موردشون انجام شده نتونستن که یه همچه سازمانی به وجود بیارن و بتونن به این شکل مبارزه کنن. یعنی با هر شکلی که هر حیله و نیرنگ و ترفندی که جمهوری اسلامی بر علیه خانواده ها و عواملش در فضای مجازی و در به اصطلاح جاهای مختلف سعی کردن این اتحاد به هم بزنن، ما باز تونستیم با هم این اتحاد رو نگه داریم و جلو ببریم. خب نتیجهش اینه امروز این به اصطلاح کیسی که در دادگاه بین‌المللی دادگستری انجام شده و پارسال 14 سپتامبر با کمک وکیلایی که اینجا هستن و اینجا نیستن امروز، ما تونستیم در کیس دادگاه بین‌المللی به اصطلاح جنایی هم این کیس رو رجیستر کنیم که باز این اتفاق در مورد هیچ کدوم از جنایت‌های دیگه پیش نیامده.
Thank you.
Want to translate?
I think I'm going to pass this one. How about that? No, mostly because there were no legal aspects to the conversation. I think we don't need to translate. It was mostly about the association's role in the pursuit of justice and how it will bring other families that are affected by the crimes of this government together. Any other questions from the media, or have we covered everybody? I think we are good. Okay, if you have time, I'd like to ask you one last question before I ask the very final question. So the PS752 case is completely unprecedented example in many aspects, for which no independent criminal or technical investigation has been conducted. Are there any hopes that the International Court can maybe initiate such investigation? If not, how is it possible to conduct investigations that are independent?
It's a really tough question.
I know. I left it for the end.
Yeah. So part of this stems, and this is a little bit in the weeds of the development in international law, but part of the difficulty here stems from the fact that over the last 100 years, the world has been on a journey in which international law has transformed itself from purely obligations between countries in which they don't look at the conduct of governments inside countries in respect of their own citizens or their activities within their own borders, to the increasing development of international law that binds governments' actions even with, or applies to governments' actions even within their own borders. And that project, I'd say, is still underway. It's incomplete. It sort of began post-World War II. I mean, it has its origins before World War II, but it picked up steam much more earnestly after World War II with the development of international human rights instruments. That is a very legalistic background, but that is to lay the foundation to say that the problem that we have here is that the international legal system is not properly constructed to deal with the issue of a military, elements of a military shooting down a civilian airliner within the country's own borders. And so we're left with the circumstance of trying to figure out how to best address it. And so we have the avenue through the International Court of Justice, which can find that Iran failed to conduct its own proper domestic criminal investigations as it is obliged to do under the 1971 Montreal Convention, but the ICJ doesn't have the capacity to ensure that those investigations are actually conducted. Compliance, there's no international army to ensure or enforce compliance with the ICJ's rulings or with the requirements of the Montreal Convention. I'd say the best hope for an actual criminal investigation outside of Iran's hands is probably through some combination of Ukraine and Canada acting on the one hand and the International Criminal Court acting on the other hand. And then if we are actually looking to Iranian authorities to conduct a fair and impartial criminal investigation, I think some changes are going to need to happen to see that take place. But those are the avenues that I see, and it's really, I appreciate it's a complex and not entirely satisfying answer, but it's sort of the state of the international legal system as we have it.
For sure, and when you look back at what happened in case of Air India Flight 182, for example, that took 20 years. For the victims' families to have a public inquiry. Yeah,
and it took 20 years to have a public inquiry, and there's a couple even key distinguishing factors there, right? That was a flight from Canada departing from Montreal, I believe.
The Air India was from Vancouver. Yeah.
It was a terrorist bombing over the North Atlantic Ocean, and so. There was more information, more control in Canada's hands, and less obstruction from other international actors. I think it was a situation involving more a pure act of terrorism, which is not virtuous by any means, but is in some ways easier for the international system to deal with in this circumstance because there's no one really standing in the way of the investigation.
And yet another reason for the IRGC's importance of it being claimed as a terrorist organization, I would say, as the body that shot the plane. And I guess what happened, or was this something similar that happened to the Pan Am Flight 103, that you know, the case in Lockerbie, that was a tragedy, was that with similar circumstances?
I think there's differing views on that. That I think is a degree closer to the circumstance of PS752, not the same circumstance, but that was several, I guess, Libyan terrorists who, about a decade or more later, it came out had links to the Libyan government itself that conducted a terrorist act on board that Pan Am flight that exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland. But really, even there, we see that the resolution to that issue took more than a decade, and was ultimately a political resolution more than a legal resolution. It took various United Nations sanctions against Libya, which were enacted in part for this reason, but in part because of Libya's other conduct that had offended the international system.
I have a question too.
For sure, go ahead. Yes, go ahead. By all means.
When I was reading the application this morning, Ryan, I noticed the word extradition of the offenders or perpetrators of this crime. What do you think about that cover of you? Is it going to happen, you think?
I wish I had a crystal ball. I don't know. But Iran does have the obligation remember, the ICJ is adjudicating obligations under the 1971 Montreal Convention, and so not to be overly legalistic, but the two countries that under that convention have the obligation of criminal prosecution are Ukraine and Iran, and so I see that the term extradition in that instrument, there might be other context I'm missing, but I see that as primarily related to an obligation that Iran has to cooperate with Ukraine in respect of a criminal investigation and extradite individuals that may be charged to Ukraine for trial.
Okay, we do have one more question from the media. Please go ahead.
Is this on?
Yes, it is.
I have a question for Ryan, and I know that financial compensation is not the point of this and what you're doing, but I'm just wondering, in your mind, when you're working this out, what reason could the court give for not following through with this? Because it is an application, the court hasn't yet accepted this. Are you sort of working those things out?
I think the case for compensation, there's a litany of cases going back.
Oh, no,
decades.
sorry. Maybe I'm not being clear.
Okay.
It's not about that. I'm wondering what would the ICJ, what reasoning could they possibly give for not going forward with this?
I think it will go forward through the stages of argument unless a negotiated settlement is arrived at, and assuming the pressure stays up on the four countries that are bringing the application to follow through with this. Ultimately, how the ICJ decides, I won't, on day one of the case, start speculating on where they're going to go with it. But I think so long as the four countries proceed in bringing this application, we are going to wind up with a judicial decision.
I think the only argument, and I alluded to this at the very beginning, the only argument that Iran, I can think it would logically be able to make, is that we've actually followed a process domestically, and therefore we've lived up to our obligations under the Montreal Convention. I don't think it's a particularly convincing argument, but I think it's one that Iran will make. It's one that Libya made with respect to the Lockerbie case that dragged out the case. And I hope that the ICJ judges will not be fooled by that, but it's, anything is possible, I suppose.
I still think that even then, I agree with that, but I would still hope even in that case, that would only address a portion of the application that is brought before the ICJ, not the whole thing, not the full grounds of relief that are sought in the full set of issues that are raised. And B, I think I would hope that even to make a determination that Iran ultimately had upheld its obligation to conduct independent criminal investigations and prosecutions in this incident, they would have to conduct the full judicial proceeding and make a determination on that point at the end of the day.
And I guess a good way to close on this question is, when do we expect a day in court? I'd like all of you to maybe make some comments about that. What is your, what were you expecting?
Unfortunately, again, it's speculative. The application was just filed, so there's no timeline set, but these matters take years to decide, unfortunately. So I think if this proceeds in under a few years, it would be very quick.
Same, are you?
I don't know if Hamid said this in Persian or English, but he said it's a matter of years, not months, and I entirely agree with that. Regrettably, the wheels of justice turn very slowly. And again, I will take off my lawyer hat, put on my political activist hat, and say, my hope is that the revolution will succeed before this case is adjudicated at the ICJ.
Truth and justice remains the mission of the association.
Absolutely.
Let's all hope for that to happen. Do you have any final remarks you want to make?
I would just reiterate that at the ICJ, these cases do take years, especially if, for example, Iran decides to contest either the jurisdiction or the admissibility of the case. It would add yet another procedural phase before the case reaches the merits. And then, of course, at the ICJ, and this is with every case, each party can sometimes have a year to come up with its filings, and then there's a counter memorial or a counter response. And so these things do really take a long time, and it's not a reflection of the case or the worthiness of the cause, but rather the way the system is designed.
Thank you. Okay. Does anyone want to make any final remarks? Anything that we haven't covered? If not, I invite everybody to join us in the rally that comes after. This panel is starting at 5 o'clock. The families will be gathering there, and we have some officials that will join us. There will be some speeches, and hope to see you all at Mel Lastman Square at 5 o'clock today.